From hymn to epic, the world of the Rigveda is not yet the world of the Bhagavad Gita. Indra dominates many hymns. Agni carries offerings between humans and gods. Soma flows. Priests recite sacred formulas. Clans compete. Cattle represent wealth. Chariots move through the poetic landscape. Centuries later, another literary universe becomes visible. Kingdoms have grown. Political structures have changed. Philosophical debates have deepened. The meaning of Dharma has expanded. And at the center of one enormous narrative stands a conflict between two branches of a royal family: the Pandavas and the Kauravas. The battlefield is called Kurukshetra. And there, immediately before the war begins, a warrior named Arjuna looks across the battlefield and sees teachers, relatives, friends, and loved ones among those he is expected to kill. His body trembles. His bow slips from his hand. He refuses to fight. Beside him stands his charioteer, his friend, his counselor, and eventually, within the sacred vision of the Bhagavad Gita, much more than any of these, Krishna. But before we can ask who Krishna is, historical figure, epic hero, divine incarnation, supreme God, or all of these within different traditions, we must first ask a more basic historical question. What is the Mahabharata, and when did the war it remembers, if a historical war lies behind it, actually take place? Chapter 14. Kurukshetra, between history, epic, and sacred time. There are battles that belong to history. There are battles that become legend. And there are battles that eventually become mirrors in which a civilization contemplates itself. Kurukshetra belongs to all three possibilities. At the center of the Mahabharata stands a catastrophic conflict between two branches of the Kuru royal family: the Pandavas and the Kauravas. Kings and warriors from many regions gather. Kinship is divided against itself. Teachers face former students. Friends stand on opposing sides. Rules intended to restrain warfare gradually collapse. Victory comes at an almost unbearable price. And in the middle of this immense epic, immediately before the fighting begins, time seems to stop. A warrior named Arjuna asks his charioteer to take him between the two armies. He looks across the battlefield, and suddenly the enemy ceases to be an abstraction. He sees people he knows: teachers, cousins, friends, relatives, men with whom he shares a world. Arjuna's crisis opens the Bhagavad Gita. His charioteer is Krishna. But before we enter Krishna's extraordinary theological identity, we must ask the historical question: did the Kurukshetra war happen? And if it did, when? The Mahabharata is not a chronicle. The first difficulty is the nature of the source itself. The Mahabharata is not a contemporary military report. It is an enormous Sanskrit epic containing roughly 100,000 verses in its received tradition, although manuscripts and recensions vary. It includes war narrative, genealogy, mythology, theology, philosophy, political reflection, pilgrimage material, moral instruction, legends, cosmology, and discussions of Dharma. The text itself grew over a long period. Modern scholarship generally understands the Mahabharata as the result of centuries of oral and textual development, with major stages of composition and redaction stretching broadly from the last centuries BCE into the first centuries CE, while acknowledging that important narrative and poetic material is older. This distinction is crucial. The date at which the surviving epic took shape is not necessarily the date of any historical conflict that may lie behind it. A society can remember a war for centuries before the story reaches its monumental literary form. Was there a historical war? Many historians consider it plausible that the epic preserves memories of conflicts among early Indo-Aryan polities in northern India. The Kuru realm itself is historically important. During the later Vedic period, The Kuru cultural and political sphere emerged in northern India, especially in regions corresponding broadly to parts of present-day Haryana and western Uttar Pradesh. The Kurush occupy an important place in the transition from the earlier Vedic world toward the later Vedic political and ritual order. This gives the epic a genuine historical landscape. Kurukshetra is not simply an imaginary continent. It is a real region. Kuru political traditions are historically meaningful. But moving from that fact to the claim that every person and event described in the Mahabharata has been historically verified would go far beyond the evidence. Archaeology does not provide us with a battlefield inscription saying, "Here Arjuna fought Karna." Nor do we possess contemporary records naming Krishna as Arjuna's charioteer. The historian, therefore, works with probabilities and layers. Around 1200–800 BCE, scholarly attempts to locate a possible historical background for the epic conflict often turn toward the late 2nd and early 1st millennium BCE, especially the period in which Kuru political culture becomes important. Proposed historical horizons vary. Dates somewhere around 1200–1000 BCE are sometimes discussed for memories underlying the conflict, while other reconstructions move parts of the relevant historical setting into the early 1st millennium BCE. Archaeological discussions often involve the painted gray ware culture, approximately associated with parts of northern India during the early Iron Age, and frequently linked cautiously with regions prominent in later Vedic literature. But there is no archaeological consensus that painted gray ware represents the Mahabharata people in any simple sense. Pottery does not carry the names of epic heroes. A ceramic tradition cannot by itself identify Krishna, Arjuna, Bhishma, Draupadi, or Yudhishthira. Archaeology provides the stage. It does not necessarily identify the actors. Traditional chronology. Hindu traditional chronology offers a very different framework. The Kurukshetra war is connected with the end of Dvapara Yuga and the beginning of Kali Yuga. A widely influential traditional calculation places the beginning of Kali Yuga in 3102 BCE. Within traditions using this chronology, Krishna's departure from the earthly world and the events surrounding the end of the Mahabharata belong to this remote date, with the war placed shortly before it. Other traditional calculations produce somewhat different dates. Some modern researchers have also attempted to date the war through astronomical descriptions contained in the epic, producing dates ranging across widely separated centuries and millennia. The problem is that the Mahabharata is textually layered. Astronomical passages may not all belong to the same historical stage. Later scribes and transmitters could preserve, modify, reinterpret, or add material. An astronomical calculation can be extremely precise mathematically, while still depending upon an uncertain assumption about the age of the textual observation being calculated. Precision is not the same as historical certainty. Sacred time and historical time. This difference should not be turned into a crude contest between faith and science. They operate according to different methods. Traditional chronology places events within a sacred cosmology of yugas, cosmic decline, dharma, and divine manifestation. Historical chronology attempts to reconstruct human events using archaeology, linguistics, textual criticism, material culture, and comparative evidence. A person may accept a sacred chronology religiously. An academic historian may be unable to verify it archaeologically. Those statements can coexist without pretending they are identical claims. Our essay, therefore, does not need to declare tradition is false, nor should it declare archaeology has proved the traditional date. Neither statement represents the evidence responsibly. We can say instead, the traditional and academic chronologies differ substantially, and the historical date of any conflict underlying the Mahabharata remains uncertain. Hastinapura. One site repeatedly associated with the epic tradition is Hastinapura, described as the capital of the Kuru dynasty. Archaeological excavations, there revealed occupation layers, including material associated with painted gray ware. A significant flood episode has sometimes been connected with a tradition that the Kuru capital was later transferred to Kaushambi after flooding. This is intriguing. But once again, correlation does not equal proof. Archaeology can demonstrate settlement and environmental events. Connecting them with a specific episode, preserved in a literary tradition, written down much later requires caution. Still, such intersections are valuable. They show that epic geography is not detached from the historical landscapes of northern India. The world of the Kuru. The emergence of the Kuru realm represents an important stage in South Asian history. Earlier Vedic society was organized strongly around clans and tribal political groupings. Over time, larger territorial formations developed. Ritual became increasingly systematized. Royal authority became more elaborate. Priestly traditions consolidated. The sacrificial system grew in complexity. The social categories later associated with Varna became increasingly articulated. The Kuru Panchala cultural sphere became one of the major centers of later Vedic civilization. If some historical memory lies behind the Mahabharata, this broad world provides a plausible background. The epic may therefore preserve echoes of a period in which clan society was becoming kingdom. And that transformation resembles, in a distant way, something we already observed in Mesopotamia. Political organization grows larger. Warfare changes. Kingship changes. And sacred traditions are forced to explain the new world. An 18-day war. In the epic, the Kurukshetra war lasts 18 days. The number 18 appears repeatedly within the Mahabharata tradition. The epic is traditionally divided into 18 major books or parvas. The Bhagavad Gita contains 18 chapters. 18 armies or akshahinis are associated with the opposing forces in the war tradition. Whether all these numerical correspondences belong to the earliest layers of the narrative is another question. But in the received epic, 18 becomes structurally important. The war itself is catastrophic. By its end, almost the entire warrior generation has been destroyed. Victory does not feel like uncomplicated triumph. The Pandavas win. And yet nearly everything they sought to preserve has been shattered. Dharma on the battlefield. The central moral problem of the Mahabharata is often expressed in one word. Dharma. But translating dharma simply as religion is inadequate. Depending upon context, it can involve duty, moral order, law, right conduct, social responsibility, cosmic order, and the appropriate way of being within one's circumstances. The tragedy of the Mahabharata is that dharma becomes difficult to see. Every side can produce arguments. Every duty conflicts with another duty. Family loyalty conflicts with justice. Compassion conflicts with warrior obligation. Truth conflicts with survival. Rules of warfare conflict with the necessity of defeating opponents who themselves violate rules. The epic does not give us a world in which good people always know exactly what to do. It gives us a world in which even righteous people become morally wounded. This is one reason the text remains psychologically extraordinary. Arjuna's breakdown. Immediately before battle, Arjuna experiences what a modern reader might recognize as an acute crisis of action, identity, and moral meaning. He sees those he must fight. His body reacts. His limbs weaken. His mouth dries. He trembles. His famous bow, Gandhava, slips. He cannot see how victory could justify what victory requires. What good is a kingdom if the people for whom one desires the kingdom must die to obtain it? This is not cowardice. It is moral paralysis. Arjuna knows how to fight. What he no longer knows is why he should fight. And that distinction changes everything. Krishna the charioteer. Krishna occupies an unusual position. He is not initially standing before Arjuna as a distant god upon a celestial throne. He is sitting beside him. He is driving the chariot. The symbolism is profound, even before later theological interpretation begins. The warrior possesses weapons. The charioteer guides direction. Arjuna possesses power. Krishna possesses vision. The human being can act. But action without understanding can become destruction. The dialogue begins because action has become impossible. Who is Krishna historically? Here the questions become difficult. The Krishna of Indian tradition is not one simple literary figure. Different textual layers reveal different aspects. Krishna Vasudeva appears as a heroic and political figure associated with the Vrishni or Yadava traditions. In the Mahabharata, he is statesman, ally, strategist, friend, counselor, charioteer, and divine figure. In the Bhagavad Gita, his identity expands dramatically. He reveals himself as the cosmic lord. Later texts, especially the Harivamsa, Vishnu Purana, and Bhagavata Purana, develop other dimensions of Krishna's life and theology. The child Krishna, the cowherd, the beloved of the gopis, the slayer of demons, the divine lover, the incarnation of Vishnu, and within some Vaishnava traditions, not merely an incarnation of a higher deity, but the original supreme reality from whom other divine manifestations proceed. These theological developments cannot simply be projected backward, unchanged into the earliest Vedic period. Krishna has a history of reception. Early evidence for Krishna Vasudeva. There is, however, important evidence that devotion to Vasudeva Krishna is ancient. By the final centuries BCE, inscriptions and external testimony demonstrate the existence of Vasudeva devotion. One particularly important artifact is the Heliodorus pillar, erected at Bisnagar in central India, generally dated to around the 2nd century BCE. Heliodorus identifies himself as a Bhagavata, a devotee associated with Vasudeva. He was a Greek ambassador. This is remarkable. By this period, devotion to Vasudeva was sufficiently established that a man of Greek origin could publicly identify himself with the tradition. Krishna devotion was therefore not a late medieval invention. Its historical roots extend deep into ancient India. Exactly how far they extend remains more difficult to establish. Krishna and Vishnu. The relationship between Krishna and Vishnu develops across textual and theological history. In many traditions, Krishna is understood as an avatara of Vishnu. But this is not the only Vaishnava interpretation. The Bhagavata Purana contains the famous statement often rendered as Krishna's two Bhagavan Svayam. Krishna, however, is Bhagavan himself. Gaudiya Vaishnavism gives enormous theological weight to this formulation. Within the tradition associated with Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Krishna is not merely one avatara among others. He is understood as Svayam Bhagavan, the original supreme personality of Godhead. Vishnu and other divine forms are understood through a theological hierarchy in which Krishna possesses the highest and most complete divine identity. This understanding became central to later Gaudiya theology and, in the modern period, to ISKCON. But Hindu traditions do not speak with one voice on this question. There is no single Hindu theology of the Supreme. A Saiva may identify Shiva as the supreme reality. A Shakta may understand Devi, the goddess, as ultimate. A Sri Vishnava may center Narayana/Vishnu. A Gaudiya Vishnava centers Krishna as Svayam Bhagavan. An Advaita Vedantin may argue that the highest truth is Nirguna Brahman, beyond all limiting attributes, while personal divine forms belong to valid but differently understood levels of religious realization. Other Vedanta schools offer still other accounts. Therefore, the statement, Krishna is the one and only supreme God, is perfectly intelligible as a specific theological claim within particular Vaishnava traditions. It should not, however, be presented historically as though every Hindu school has always accepted the same doctrine. The disagreement is not a defect in Hindu tradition. It is part of its history. One text, different Krishnas. Even the Bhagavad Gita has been interpreted through radically different philosophical systems. Shankara reads it through Advaita, Ramanuja through Vishishtadvaita, Madhva through Dvaita. Later Vaishnava traditions develop further interpretations. Gaudiya commentators understand Krishna through the theology of bhakti, centered upon his supreme personal identity. The words remain largely the same. The metaphysics changes. This is one of the fascinating features of sacred literature. A text can unite a civilization, while its interpretation divides schools within it. The battlefield inside the human being. Whatever historical date we assign to Kurukshetra, the reason the Bhagavad Gita survived is not primarily that readers wanted a military record. The battlefield became psychological and spiritual. Arjuna stands between competing duties. He must act, but action binds. He must care, but attachment blinds. He must confront death, but the deepest self is said not to die. Krishna's response moves through multiple paths. Action without attachment. Knowledge. Discipline of mind. Meditation. Devotion. Surrender. Vision of the cosmic form. The battlefield becomes a laboratory of consciousness. And here, unexpectedly, our Indian journey begins to touch Gilgamesh again. Gilgamesh and Arjuna. The comparison should not be pushed too far. They belong to radically different texts. But consider their crises. Gilgamesh encounters death through the body of Enkidu. Arjuna encounters death before the bodies have fallen. Gilgamesh asks, how can I avoid death? Arjuna asks, how can I act when death is unavoidable? Gilgamesh travels outward, seeking the secret of immortality. Arjuna remains between two armies, while Krishna directs him inward, toward the nature of the self. Gilgamesh learns that his body cannot become immortal. The Gita teaches Arjuna that the deepest self, Atman, is not destroyed when the body is destroyed. Two civilizations confront the same terror. They give different answers. And those answers reveal their metaphysical worlds. What was happening in Israel? There is one final comparison we should make before leaving the historical question. If a possible historical horizon for memories behind the Kurukshetra conflict lies somewhere around the late 2nd or early 1st millennium BCE, what was happening in the Levant? This places us broadly within the centuries in which the social and political world that would eventually produce ancient Israel was emerging. Around the end of the late Bronze Age and beginning of the Iron Age, the Eastern Mediterranean experienced enormous disruption. Major political systems collapsed or transformed. Egyptian power in Canaan weakened. New settlement patterns appeared in the highlands. The earliest known extra-biblical reference to a people called Israel appears on the Merneptah stele, usually dated to approximately 1208 BCE. This is extremely important. By the late 13th century BCE, a group identified as Israel was known in Canaan. But the kingdoms of Israel and Judah known from later biblical history had not yet developed into their later political forms. If we place a possible early historical horizon for the Kuru traditions around these centuries, then while Kuru society was developing in northern India, early Israelite identity was emerging in the Levant. Neither civilization knew that, millennia later, their sacred texts would be read side by side. Two sacred histories begin to take shape. The comparison is not one of direct influence. There is no evidence that early Israelites knew the Mahabharata or that Kuru communities knew Israelite traditions. The geographical distance was enormous, but chronologically, the comparison is illuminating. Across Eurasia, societies were moving through transformations. Bronze Age political systems were giving way to new Iron Age formations. Older tribal structures were becoming kingdoms. Religious traditions were being preserved and reformulated. Oral memory was becoming sacred history. In northern India, the world of later Vedic culture was developing. In the Levant, the communities from which Israelite and Judean traditions would emerge were taking shape. Human beings in both worlds were asking questions of order, kingship, sacrifice, war, divine authority, and moral obligation. The answers would become very different. But the questions belong to humanity. And Krishna steps forward. We are now ready to ask the question that cannot be avoided. Who is Krishna? Not merely. Who is Krishna according to one devotional tradition? But how did the figure of Krishna develop historically? What are the earliest references to Krishna and Vasudeva? When does Krishna become identified with Vishnu? When does the theology of Bhagavan emerge? What do the Mahabharata, Bhagavad Gita, Harivamsa, Vishnu Purana, and Bhagavata Purana each contribute? And why do Vishnavas, Saivas, Shaktas, Smartas, Advaitins, Devaitins, and other traditions arrive at different answers concerning the ultimate divine reality? If we want to understand Krishna fairly, we cannot begin by deciding in advance which school must be correct. We must first listen to the traditions themselves. Only then can we see where history ends and theology begins. Chapter 15, Krishna from Hero to the Supreme. Few figures in the history of religion have acquired as many identities as Krishna. He is a child stealing butter, a cowherd playing the flute, the beloved of the gopis, the friend of Arjuna, a diplomat attempting to prevent war, a strategist whose decisions alter the course of Kurukshetra, a teacher of yoga, an avatar of Vishnu, the cosmic lord who reveals within his body the terrifying totality of existence, and within several Vaishnava traditions, something even greater. Not merely an incarnation of God, but God himself. For millions of devotees, there is no contradiction among these identities. The child of Vrindavana and the lord of the cosmos are the same Krishna. But historically, these dimensions become visible in different textual layers and religious environments. To understand Krishna, therefore, we must distinguish two questions that are often confused. What can historical scholarship tell us about the development of Krishna traditions? And who is Krishna according to the traditions that worship him? The answers overlap, but they are not identical. Krishna before the Bhagavad Gita. One of the difficulties in reconstructing the earliest Krishna tradition is that the name Krishna occurs in more than one ancient context. The Sanskrit word Krishna means dark or black, and it can function as an adjective as well as a personal name. A figure called Krishna Angarasa appears in Vedic tradition. Another intriguing reference occurs in the Chandogya Upanishad, where a Krishna, son of Devaki, Devakaputra Krishna, is mentioned as receiving instruction from the sage Gora Angarasa. This passage has attracted enormous attention because Krishna, son of Devaki, immediately recalls the later Krishna of epic and devotional tradition. Many scholars consider a relationship possible or probable. But the passage does not tell the later biography of Krishna. There is no Vrindavana, no Radha, no Kurukshetra narrative, no declaration that this Krishna is the supreme personality of Godhead. It is therefore important evidence, but not a complete bridge to the later theological figure. Ancient identities often become visible to us only in fragments. Vasudeva. Another name becomes essential. Vasudeva. In later tradition, Krishna is Vasudeva because he is the son of Vasudeva. But Vasudeva also develops into a divine designation. Evidence from ancient India suggests the existence of a devotional tradition centered upon Vasudeva, probably associated initially with a heroic or deified figure connected with the Vrishni clan. Over time, this tradition became integrated with other religious currents. The figure of Krishna, Vasudeva, the Vrishni heroes, Narayana, Vishnu. These identities and traditions gradually converge. The result will eventually become one of the great theological traditions of India. A Greek witness. One of the most fascinating pieces of evidence comes not from a Hindu text, but from a Greek writer. Megasthenes, the Greek ambassador to the court of Chandragupta Maurya around the late 4th or early 3rd century BCE, wrote about India in a work called the Indica. The original work has been lost, but later authors preserve fragments. Among the reports attributed to Megasthenes is a statement that a people called the Saurasnai particularly honored Heracles. Scholars have long debated the identity of this Indian, Heracles. A common interpretation connects the Saurasnai with Shurasna, the region associated with Mathura, and suggests that the deity identified by the Greek observer as Heracles may have been Krishna or a closely related Vasudeva Krishna figure. The identification is plausible, but not absolutely certain. Still, if correct, it provides remarkable evidence. By the early Hellenistic period, a Krishna-related deity was already prominent enough in northern India to attract the attention of Greek observers. The Heliodorus pillar. More concrete evidence appears in the 2nd century BCE. At Bisnagar in central India stands a stone column erected by a man named Heliodorus. Heliodorus was an ambassador of the Indo-Greek king Antialcidas to an Indian ruler. The inscription identifies him as a Bhagavata, a devotee of Vasudeva. The pillar itself is dedicated in connection with Vasudeva, described as God of gods in the inscription. This is one of the most important pieces of archaeological evidence for early Vaishnava or Bhagavata devotion. And there is something wonderful about the person who left it. Heliodorus was not originally from an Indian cultural background. He was a Greek ambassador. Yet he publicly identified himself with devotion to Vasudeva. Religious traditions were crossing cultural boundaries more than 2,000 years ago. The ancient world was already global in ways we sometimes underestimate. Krishna in the Mahabharata. Within the Mahabharata, Krishna is already extraordinary. He is politically active. He belongs to the Yadava Vrishni world. He is related to the Pandavas. He advises them. He attempts diplomacy. He becomes Arjuna's charioteer. He participates in strategies that determine the outcome of the war. Yet he is not simply another heroic warrior. Throughout the epic, Krishna's divine status becomes increasingly explicit. He is identified with Narayana. He is associated with Vishnu. He is recognized as possessing a cosmic identity, transcending his human role. The epic, therefore, stands at a crucial point in the historical development of Krishna theology. Hero and deity have become inseparable. The Bhagavad Gita changes the scale. Then comes the Bhagavad Gita. Whatever earlier stages of Krishna tradition may have existed, the Krishna of the Gita speaks with a theological authority of extraordinary magnitude. He does not merely say, "I know the truth." He speaks as the source and ground of cosmic reality. He teaches Arjuna about action, knowledge, meditation, devotion, the self, nature, rebirth, liberation, and his own divine identity. Krishna declares himself the source from which existence proceeds. He describes himself as dwelling within beings. He receives sacrifice. He becomes the object of devotion. And eventually, he reveals the Vishvarupa, the universal form. The universal form. Arjuna is given divine sight. Then the familiar Krishna disappears into something almost impossible to describe. Countless mouths, countless eyes, divine ornaments, weapons, celestial radiance, the entire universe contained within one being. Gods, sages, worlds, all directions. And then something terrifying. Arjuna sees warriors entering Krishna's blazing mouths. He sees them destroyed. The divine form is not merely beautiful. It is catastrophic. Krishna declares himself time, the mighty destroyer of worlds. The god whom Arjuna knows as friend and charioteer is revealed as the process within which civilizations, armies, bodies, and generations arise and disappear. This is not the gentle Krishna of later pastoral devotion. It is cosmic divinity in its terrifying totality. Creation and destruction belong to the same vision. From Vishvarupa to Vrindavana. And yet Indian religious history moves toward another extraordinary transformation. The cosmic Lord becomes increasingly intimate. Later Krishna traditions develop the stories of his childhood and youth in Gokula and Vrindavana. He steals butter. His mother Yashoda attempts to discipline him. He plays with cowherd boys. He protects the community. He plays the flute. The gopis leave ordinary life to answer its call. The relationship between humanity and God becomes increasingly expressed through bhakti, devotion. The distance between divine and human begins to collapse. The Lord of the cosmos can be loved as a child, as a friend, as a beloved. This represents one of the most remarkable theological developments in the history of religion. The infinite becomes intimate. Was Radha always there? For many modern devotees, Krishna and Radha are almost unimaginable apart. But Radha does not occupy the same position in the earliest Krishna literature that she later acquires. The Mahabharata does not present the fully developed Radha-Krishna theology familiar from later devotional traditions. The Bhagavad Purana, enormously important for Krishna bhakti, celebrates Krishna's relationships with the gopis, but does not straightforwardly develop Radha by name in the form later traditions do. Over subsequent centuries, especially through Sanskrit and vernacular devotional literature, Radha becomes increasingly central. The Gita Govinda of Jayadva, composed in the 12th century CE, became especially influential in developing the sacred erotic imagery of Radha and Krishna. Later Gaudiya Vaishnavism would give their relationship extraordinary theological depth. Radha becomes not merely Krishna's beloved. She becomes the supreme embodiment of devotion, and within Gaudiya theology, Krishna's own internal pleasure potency, Ladina Shakti. Again, we see the same process. Religious traditions develop. Development does not necessarily mean invention from nothing. It means that possibilities contained within a tradition become increasingly explicit. Krishna and Vishnu, who comes first? Here we reach one of the questions that produces real disagreement among Hindu traditions. A familiar popular formulation says, Krishna is an avatar of Vishnu. This is entirely legitimate within many Hindu theological frameworks. Vishnu descends through various avatars to restore Dharma. Rama is an avatara. Krishna is an avatara. The famous idea is expressed in the Bhagavad Gita. Whenever Dharma declines and adharma rises, the divine manifests. But some Vaishnava traditions reverse the hierarchy. Krishna is not ultimately derived from Vishnu. Rather, Vishnu's forms proceed from Krishna. The most famous textual basis for this claim comes from the Bhagavad Purana. Krishna's two Bhagavan Svayam. Krishna, however, is Bhagavan himself. For Gaudiya Vaishnavism, this statement is decisive. Krishna is Svayam Bhagavan, the original supreme personality of Godhead. Chaitanya and Gaudiya Vaishnavism. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu became the central figure of a devotional movement in Bengal and Odisha that would develop into Gaudiya Vaishnavism. The movement emphasized passionate devotion to Radha and Krishna and the chanting of the divine names. Within Gaudiya theology, Krishna is the original Supreme Lord. But Chaitanya himself receives an even more subtle theological interpretation. He is understood as Krishna appearing in the devotional mood and radiance of Radha. God becomes the devotee in order to experience the devotee's love for God. This creates a remarkable theological circle. Krishna desires to understand Radha's love. He therefore appears as Chaitanya. The object of devotion becomes the practitioner of devotion. Divinity seeks to experience itself from the side of love. From Chaitanya to ISKCON. Centuries later, Gaudiya Vaishnavism entered a global phase through A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, who founded the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, ISKCON, in 1966. Prabhupada presented Gaudiya Vaishnava theology to audiences across Europe, North America, and eventually the world. Central to this teaching is the claim that Krishna is not simply one Hindu deity among many. He is the supreme personality of Godhead. Other divine beings occupy different positions within a cosmic hierarchy. Vishnu forms are understood through Krishna. Shiva possesses a unique theological status, but is not identical in every respect with Krishna. Devas such as Indra, Surya, Agni, and others are powerful divine beings, but are not the ultimate supreme. Within the Gaudiya system, this theology is coherent. But it is important to add 3 words. Within that system, what would a Saiva say? A devotee belonging to a Saiva tradition may begin from a very different premise. For many Saivas, Shiva is the Supreme Lord. In traditions of Saiva Siddhanta, Kashmir Shaivism, and other Saiva systems, the ultimate divine reality is articulated through Shiva in ways that cannot simply be subordinated to Krishna theology without abandoning the tradition's own metaphysical structure. A Saiva can read texts praising Shiva as supreme, just as a Vaishnava reads texts praising Vishnu or Krishna as supreme. This is not merely a disagreement about names. Different metaphysical systems are involved. What would a Shakta say? For a Shakta, ultimate reality may be understood as Devi, the goddess, or Shakti, divine power itself. Texts such as the Devi Mahatmya present the goddess not merely as the consort of a male deity, but as supreme divine reality. Gods themselves depend upon her power. From within this theological universe, asking whether Krishna or Shiva is above, Devi may already misunderstand the system. The hierarchy has changed again. And Advaita. Then comes Advaita Vedanta. Here the question itself is transformed. If ultimate reality is Brahman, without second, then the deepest truth cannot ultimately be a competition among separate divine personalities. Krishna, Shiva, Devi, Vishnu. Different forms can function as Ishvara, the personal divine approached through devotion. But ultimate reality, in classical Advaita, transcends limiting distinctions. Nirguna Brahman is beyond name and form. From this perspective, asking, which God is the highest individual God, may belong to a level of understanding that non-dual realization eventually transcends. Gaudiya Vaishnavism strongly disagrees. For it, personality is not a limitation that must ultimately disappear. Divine personality is the highest reality. The disagreement could hardly be more fundamental. Is the absolute personal? Here we reach the philosophical heart of the dispute. Is ultimate reality fundamentally personal or impersonal? Or does it transcend the distinction between personal and impersonal? Is consciousness ultimately relational? Does the highest state consist in realizing identity with Brahman? Or in eternally loving God while remaining distinct from God? Or in a paradoxical relation of simultaneous unity and difference. These are not minor, doctrinal disagreements. They represent different answers to one of humanity's oldest metaphysical questions. What is the nature of the absolute? Shankara. Adi Shankara, conventionally dated to around the 8th century CE, became the great systematizer of Advaita Vedanta. In Advaita, the deepest self, Atman, is not ultimately separate from Brahman. Ignorance, avidya, causes us to experience ourselves as isolated beings within a world of multiplicity. Liberating knowledge reveals the deeper non-dual reality. The famous Upanishadic statements become central. Tat Tivamasi, you are that. Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman. From this perspective, liberation is fundamentally realization. Ramanuja, traditionally dated to the 11th and 12th centuries, developed Vishishtadvaita, often translated as qualified non-dualism. He rejected the Advaitic interpretation that ultimate differentiation can be reduced to ignorance. The individual soul and world are real. They exist in profound dependence upon Brahman, understood personally as Narayana. Unity does not eliminate difference. Devotion, therefore, possesses an ontological foundation. The lover and the beloved are not ultimately dissolved into an undifferentiated identity. Madhva, associated with the 13th century, developed Dvaita Vedanta. The distinction between God and individual souls is real and eternal. Vishnu is supreme. Souls depend upon God, but do not become identical with God. Again, the same Upanishads, the same Bhagavad Gita, and the same Brahma Sutras produce a radically different metaphysical system. Chaitanya's Achintya Bheda. Gaudiya Vaishnavism articulates its position through the concept of Achintya Bheda. Inconceivable, simultaneous difference and non-difference. The individual soul is one with Krishna in one sense and different from Krishna in another. The relationship cannot be reduced completely to ordinary logical categories. Reality is relational. Difference is not merely ignorance, but neither is separation absolute. The soul belongs to Krishna and participates in divine reality while remaining capable of relationship with him. Love requires both unity and difference. If lover and beloved were absolutely unrelated, love would be impossible. If they were absolutely identical in every sense, relationship would disappear. Gaudiya theology therefore places love at the center of metaphysics. Can one tradition prove the other's wrong? Historically, Hindu schools certainly argued that their interpretations were superior. Indian philosophy developed extraordinarily sophisticated traditions of debate. Thinkers criticized opponents. They defended scripture. They developed logic and epistemology. They did not always speak in the modern language of religious pluralism. But from our comparative position, we should distinguish internal theological truth claims from historical description. We can accurately say, Gaudiya Vaishnavism teaches that Krishna is Svayam Bhagavan. We can accurately say, many Saiva traditions understand Shiva as supreme. We can accurately say, Shakta traditions can identify Devi as ultimate reality. We can accurately say, Advaita understands ultimate reality through non-dual Brahman. History can document these claims. History cannot perform a laboratory experiment proving which metaphysical claim is ultimately true. At that boundary, history becomes philosophy and theology. Krishna as a historical person. Can we go further and ask whether Krishna himself was historical? Yes, but the answer remains uncertain. The antiquity of Vasudeva Krishna worship is historically demonstrable. The development of Krishna traditions can be traced through texts, inscriptions, iconography, and religious communities. It is possible that a historical heroic figure, clan leader, or revered teacher lies behind some aspects of Krishna tradition. but we do not possess contemporary evidence allowing us to reconstruct a biography of a historical Krishna comparable with what might be attempted for much later historical figures. The Krishna accessible to us is already surrounded by sacred memory. History reaches toward him. Tradition reaches much further. The difference between history and devotion. Perhaps the most important thing is not to ask one method to perform the work of another. Archaeology can ask, when does evidence for Vasudeva worship appear? Philology can ask, which textual layers appear earlier? Historical linguistics can ask, how did concepts and names develop? Theology asks, who is Krishna ultimately? Devotion asks another question entirely. How can I love Krishna? A carbon date cannot answer that question. Nor can devotion provide a radiocarbon date. Confusion begins when we demand that one form of knowledge replace all others. The flute and the universal form. Perhaps no contrast captures Krishna better than two images. In one, Krishna stands before Arjuna and reveals the universal form. Worlds arise within him. Worlds disappear. Time devours armies. The vision is almost unbearable. In another, Krishna stands beneath a tree in Vrindavana and plays a flute. No armies. No cosmic terror. Only music. The infinite attracts rather than overwhelms. For later bhakti traditions, these are not two different gods. They are two ways in which the absolute can be encountered. Power can reveal God, but so can beauty. Fear can reveal transcendence, but so can love. And Gaudiya Vaishnavism will eventually make a radical claim. The sweetness of Krishna in Vrindavana reveals something higher, in devotional intimacy, than the majesty of cosmic power. The absolute does not reach its highest expression by becoming more distant. It becomes more intimate. From Krishna back to civilization. We have traveled a very long way from the first Ubaid villages. Yet perhaps the journey is not as fragmented as it appears. In Mesopotamia, humans built temples so that gods could dwell within cities. In the Vedic world, humans maintained sacred relationships through sacrifice and sound. In the Upanishads, the search moved inward toward the deepest self. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna stands beside a human being experiencing moral collapse and speaks of the eternal self. In bhakti, the divine becomes the object of personal love. Different civilizations continually renegotiate the distance between human beings and the sacred. Sometimes God is above the temple, sometimes within the fire, sometimes within the heart, sometimes driving the chariot, sometimes playing the flute. But our journey still lacks one final comparison. We have followed Mesopotamia into the Bible. We have followed Harappa toward the Vedas. We have watched flood stories cross cultural horizons. We have encountered Sargon and Moses, Gilgamesh and mortality, Noah and Utnapishtim, Manu and the cosmic waters, Krishna and the eternal self. Now we must place these civilizations beside one another without forcing them to become the same. What did they actually share? What developed independently? What could have traveled through trade? What cannot yet be demonstrated? And why do human beings separated by thousands of kilometers repeatedly tell stories about creation, catastrophe, divine order, mortality, sacrifice, and the possibility of transcending death? That question will take us from comparative history into the deeper meaning of civilization itself. Chapter 16. Roads Between Worlds. What could ancient civilizations have shared? When ancient civilizations are placed beside one another, similarities can become intoxicating. A child floats upon a river. A flood destroys the world. A vessel preserves life. Humanity emerges from earth. A serpent appears near the mystery of life and death. Gods descend. Kings claim divine authority. Sacrifice connects heaven and earth. A hero seeks immortality. Another is told that the deepest self cannot die. Separated by centuries and thousands of kilometers, human beings appear to return again and again to similar images. The temptation is immediate. There must have been one original story, one forgotten civilization, one ancient revelation from which all later religions descended. Or perhaps, at the opposite extreme, every similarity is accidental, and each civilization developed entirely by itself. Neither conclusion is adequate. The ancient world was neither completely unified nor completely isolated. It was a network, but the network had limits. Some ideas traveled. Some developed independently. Some may have arisen independently and later influenced one another. And for many of the most fascinating similarities, the evidence does not allow us to know which process occurred. The intellectually responsible position, therefore, lies between credulity and dismissal. We must follow the roads. The ancient world was connected. Modern maps can mislead us. We look at Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus region, Anatolia, Iran, Central Asia, and the Levant as separate countries or cultural zones. Ancient people did not see political geography in this way. Merchants traveled. Pastoral groups migrated. Armies crossed borders. Diplomats carried letters. Craft specialists moved between courts. Prisoners were deported. Priests traveled to sacred centers. Foreign wives entered royal families. Interpreters mediated between languages. Objects crossed distances far greater than the people who eventually possessed them understood. By the 3rd millennium BCE, exchange networks already connected enormous parts of Western and Southern Asia. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan reached Mesopotamia and Egypt. Carnelian moved across long-distance networks. Metals traveled. Timber traveled. Shell traveled. Textiles traveled. And if objects traveled, stories could travel with the people carrying them. Mesopotamia and the Indus. Here we possess concrete evidence. Mesopotamian texts speak of Meluha, widely associated with the Indus civilization or territories closely connected with it. Indus-style seals and objects have been discovered in Mesopotamian contexts. Mesopotamian sources refer to Meluhan goods and individuals. And, as we have already seen, one text even refers to a Meluha interpreter. This is not speculation. Contact existed. But what does contact prove? It proves that human beings from these cultural worlds could encounter one another. It proves that goods and information could move. It establishes a plausible pathway for cultural transmission. It does not tell us exactly which myths traveled along that pathway. A merchant may carry a religious story. He may also carry only carnelian. Archaeology cannot hear the conversation. Dilmun, the Middle World. Between Mesopotamia and regions farther east stood Dilmun, generally associated especially with ancient Bahrain and the eastern Arabian Gulf. Dilmun played an important role in Gulf trade. Ships moving between southern Mesopotamia and eastern regions could pass through networks connected with Dilmun and Magan, generally associated with Oman and neighboring areas. This created a maritime corridor. Mesopotamia was not looking eastward into an empty horizon. There were ports, trading communities, intermediaries, sailors, languages, stories, religious practices, a chain of human contact, connected worlds that modern readers often imagine as completely separate. The Iranian plateau. The overland routes were equally important. Between Mesopotamia and South Asia lay the enormous cultural landscape of the Iranian plateau. This was not merely empty space between major civilizations. Communities there possessed their own settlements, political systems, technologies, religious traditions, and trade networks. Regions including Elam, centered in southwestern Iran, interacted repeatedly with Mesopotamia. Farther east, archaeological cultures connected Iran, Central Asia, Afghanistan, and South Asia. Ideas did not need to jump directly from Babylon to Harappa. They could move gradually, one community to another, one language to another, one generation to another. By the time a story reached the end of such a chain, it might be almost unrecognizable. Stories do not travel intact. This is essential. When a physical object travels, its material form may remain largely recognizable. A bead remains a bead. A seal remains a seal. A story behaves differently. Every storyteller can alter it. Names chain. Gods chain. Geography changes. Motives change. An old myth can enter a new religion and acquire a new theology. This is why searching for identical stories can actually cause us to miss transmission. A story may have traveled precisely because it was transformed. The flood as a case study. The Mesopotamian and biblical flood traditions provide our strongest example. Here we do not merely have water. We have a sequence, divine decision, warning of one favored human, construction of a vessel, preservation of life, catastrophic flood, resting of the vessel, release of birds, sacrifice after survival, a changed relationship between humanity and the divine. The density of these similarities, combined with the historical relationship between Mesopotamia and the Levant, makes literary or traditional dependence highly plausible. Exactly how the tradition moved, and through how many intermediate forms remains more difficult to reconstruct. When we turn to Manu, the situation changes. There is still warning, vessel, flood, survivor, renewal. But many specific elements differ. A fish becomes the savior. The theology differs. The cosmology differs. The textual history differs. And although ancient contact between Mesopotamia and South Asia certainly existed, we cannot demonstrate a direct textual line from Atrahasis to Manu. The comparison remains important. The certainty becomes lower. Sargon and Moses. The Sargon-Moses parallel occupies another interesting position. The distinctive cluster is striking. An infant. Dangerous or secret circumstances of birth. A basket or small vessel made from plant material. Bituminous waterproofing. A river. Rescue by another person. A new upbringing. And an extraordinary future. The possibility of literary relationship deserves serious consideration. But again, chronology complicates matters. Historical Sargon is far older than the surviving manuscripts of his birth legend. The Moses tradition itself developed over time. Therefore, the statement, Sargon lived before Moses, is historically very different from the statement, the biblical author copied a written Sargon birth story. The first concerns the chronology of a king. The second concerns the chronology and transmission of texts. They cannot simply be equated. Karna and the river. When we add Karna, the comparison becomes broader. Kunti gives birth under socially dangerous circumstances. The infant is placed in a container. He is sent upon a river. Another family finds and raises him. His true identity remains hidden. He becomes an extraordinary warrior. The resemblance to the exposed child pattern is undeniable. But once again, direct borrowing cannot simply be assumed. The Mahabharata possesses a long and complicated history. The motif of the abandoned extraordinary child occurs widely. And the social meaning of Karna's story is deeply embedded within the epic's concerns with birth, status, loyalty, honor, and tragic identity. The same narrative skeleton can carry very different cultural meanings. Could there be a common Indo-European inheritance? Another pathway of similarity has nothing to do with Mesopotamian borrowing. Sanskrit belongs to the Indo-European language family. So do Greek, Latin, ancient Iranian languages, and many later European and South Asian languages. This linguistic relationship implies deep prehistoric cultural relationships among ancestral populations. Comparative mythology has therefore identified possible correspondences among ancient Indo-European divine and heroic traditions. The Vedic Dios Pater is linguistically related to Greek Zeus Pater and Latin Jupiter, ultimately from a reconstructed Indo-European expression referring to the Sky Father. This is not a vague, symbolic similarity. It is supported by systematic linguistic correspondences. Here we possess a different kind of evidence. Not trade between historical civilizations, not literary borrowing between known texts, but inheritance from a much older common linguistic cultural past. Indra and other dragon slayers. The Rigveda celebrates Indra's defeat of Vritra, the serpent or dragon-like being who obstructs the waters. Indra strikes Vritra with the Vajra. The waters are released. Comparative Indo-European mythology has long examined parallels between this pattern and other traditions involving a storm or heroic deity defeating a serpent or dragon. Greek Zeus confronts Typhon. Norse Thor confronts the world serpent Jormungandr. Other Indo-European traditions preserve related combat motifs. But similar dragon-slaying stories also occur outside Indo-European traditions. Mesopotamian Marduk defeats Tiamat in the Babylonian Enuma Elish. The biblical tradition contains poetic images of God defeating sea monsters, such as Leviathan. The Canaanite god Baal battles Yam and the serpent Latan. Are all these stories one story? Probably not in any simple sense. Some belong to historically connected Near Eastern mythological environments. Some may preserve Indo-European inheritance. Some may reflect broader symbolic patterns involving storm, chaos, water, and political order. Again, several mechanisms can operate simultaneously. Chaos and order. Why is the dragon so common? Because the dragon is an almost perfect symbolic body for chaos. It combines animal categories. It inhabits water, earth, or the edges of the known world. It resists ordinary human control. When a god or hero defeats the monster, order emerges. Waters are released. The world becomes habitable. A kingdom becomes possible. Cosmic combat becomes political theology. The king who defeats enemies imitates the god who defeats chaos. This pattern was especially powerful in civilizations whose survival depended upon controlling unpredictable natural forces. The myth says, chaos exists. Order is fragile. Someone must continually restore it. Creation from a primordial being. Another fascinating comparison appears in traditions where cosmic order emerges from the division of a primordial being. In the RG Vedic Purusha Sukta, the cosmic being Purusha is sacrificed. From his body emerge elements of the cosmos and social order. In Norse mythology, the primordial giant Ymir is killed, and the world is fashioned from his body. In other traditions, cosmic creation likewise involves the transformation or division of a primordial being. These comparisons have attracted scholars of Indo-European mythology. But once again, we must distinguish linguistic cultural inheritance from universal symbolism. The body provides human beings with their most immediate model of an organized whole. It is therefore unsurprising that cultures can imagine the cosmos as a body. What strengthens a historical comparison is not merely the image, but clusters of corresponding structures supported by linguistic and cultural evidence. Sacrifice. Sacrifice may be one of the most widespread religious technologies in ancient civilization. Mesopotamians offered food, drink, animals, incense, and precious objects to gods. Vedic religion developed an extraordinarily sophisticated sacrificial system centered upon yajna. Ancient Israelite religion developed its own sacrificial institutions. Greek religion offered animals and libations. Iranian traditions possessed related Indo-Iranian ritual inheritances. Does this mean sacrifice had one historical origin? Not necessarily. Giving valuable things to powerful beings is a concept that could emerge repeatedly. But particular ritual vocabularies and structures can reveal historical relationships. The Indo-Iranian comparison, for example, can be much more specific because Sanskrit and Avestan ritual terminology preserves cognate forms. Here, language becomes archaeological evidence of another kind. Fire. Fire provides another extraordinary point of comparison. In Vedic religion, Agni is both physical fire and divine mediator. Offerings placed into the sacrificial flame are carried toward the gods. In ancient Iranian religion, sacred fire becomes enormously important within Zoroastrian practice. In Greek, Roman, Mesopotamian, and Israelite traditions, fire also belongs to sacrifice and divine manifestation. Why? Because fire transforms matter. The offering disappears. Smoke rises. Solid becomes invisible. Fire, therefore, provides an almost natural symbolic bridge between worlds. What enters the flame leaves ordinary human possession. The physical process itself suggests transcendence. No cultural borrowing is required to explain the universal religious power of fire. But specific ritual systems can still travel historically. The axial temptation. At this stage, another tempting theory appears. Perhaps humanity everywhere passed through the same spiritual stages. Nature worship, polytheism, sacrifice, philosophy, monotheism, mysticism. Older histories of religion often proposed evolutionary sequences of this kind. Today we should be cautious. Religious traditions do not all move along one staircase. Monotheism does not simply replace myth. Philosophy does not simply replace ritual. Bhakti does not simply replace Vedic sacrifice. Mysticism can coexist with institutional religion. Ancient and modern forms can survive together for millennia. Civilizations branch. They do not march in single file. Did one forgotten civilization teach them all? This question appears repeatedly in esoteric and alternative histories. Perhaps it is suggested Sumer, Egypt, India, and other civilizations inherited their knowledge from a much older lost civilization. Atlantis is the most famous candidate. Other theories invoke vanished advanced cultures existing before the end of the last ice age. The attraction of such theories is understandable. They offer a single explanation for widespread similarities. But archaeological reasoning requires more. A civilization capable of transmitting complex astronomy, architecture, writing, religion, and technology across continents should leave a substantial material signature. Settlements, tools, waste, burials, trade goods, genetic traces, agricultural transformations, technological sequences, writing. So far, archaeology has not produced evidence requiring such a lost global parent civilization to explain the emergence of Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus civilization, or early Chinese civilization. This does not mean archaeology knows everything. It means that mystery should not be converted into evidence. What we do not know is not automatically proof of what we imagine. But human prehistory is becoming older. At the same time, archaeology has repeatedly forced us to abandon simplistic pictures of prehistoric humanity. Sites such as Göbekli Tepe demonstrate sophisticated monumental and ritual activity among communities around the 10th millennium BCE. Earlier assumptions that monumental sacred architecture could appear only after fully developed agricultural civilization had to be reconsidered. Human symbolic culture is far older than writing. Religion is older than temples in the conventional urban sense. Storytelling is certainly far older than any surviving written myth. This means that the first written version of a story is almost never necessarily the first time humans told anything like it. Writing gives us a terminus of visibility, not necessarily a point of origin. Before the first tablet, imagine the problem. The oldest surviving written flood story may have been copied onto clay at a particular date. But how long had people told flood stories before someone wrote one down? 10 years? 500? 2,000? We cannot know. Oral tradition leaves different traces from writing. This is why statements such as, "The Sumerians invented the flood story," should be avoided. What we can say is, Mesopotamia preserves some of the earliest surviving written flood traditions known to us. That is historically defensible. The distinction may seem small. It changes everything. The same human mind. There is another possibility that requires no traveling merchant and no lost civilization. Human beings everywhere possess similar bodies. We are born helpless. We fear abandonment. We experience storms. We watch rivers flood. We dream. We lose parents. We bury the dead. We see snakes shed their skins. We watch the sun disappear and return. We experience sexuality, jealousy, violence, love, illness, old age, death. Why should human stories not sometimes resemble one another? A child abandoned by its mother is universally terrifying. A flood is universally destructive. A serpent shedding its skin naturally suggests renewal. The sun naturally suggests death and return. The mountain naturally suggests proximity to heaven. The cave naturally suggests descent into another world. Some similarities may therefore arise, not because stories traveled, but because human beings are human everywhere. Jung and the archetype. Much later, Carl Gustav Jung would propose another way of thinking about recurring symbolic patterns. He argued that certain fundamental forms, archetypes, arise from structures of the collective unconscious. The hero, the mother, the shadow, death and rebirth, the wise old man, the divine child, the journey into darkness. From a Jungian perspective, similar myths can emerge independently because human psychic life contains recurrent structures. This is a psychological theory, not an archaeological demonstration. It cannot prove why a particular ancient story appeared in a particular place, but it provides a useful reminder. Historical transmission is not the only possible explanation for symbolic similarity. A myth can have both a history and a psychology. 4 levels of comparison. At this point, we can formulate a method for everything we have examined. When 2 ancient traditions resemble one another, we should ask which of 4 levels best describes the evidence. First, demonstrable historical contact. We possess evidence that the cultures interacted. Mesopotamia and the Indus world belong here. Mesopotamia and the Levant certainly belong here. Second, probable or plausible transmission. The similarities are sufficiently specific, and historical pathways sufficiently strong, that some form of literary or traditional relationship is likely. The Mesopotamian and biblical flood traditions belong strongly in this category. Third, possible relationship without demonstrable transmission. The similarities are meaningful, but the pathway cannot be reconstructed securely. Some comparisons involving Manu and Mesopotamian flood traditions may belong here. Fourth, recurrent human motif. The image is so widespread and so easily generated by universal human experience that independent development remains entirely plausible. Water, fire, sacred mountains, serpents, divine children, death and rebirth. These categories protect us from two opposite errors: seeing borrowing everywhere and seeing isolation everywhere. Civilization as conversation. Perhaps civilizations should not be imagined as sealed boxes. A better image is conversation. Sometimes the speakers meet directly. Sometimes one hears the other through an interpreter. Sometimes a story is inherited from grandparents whose own source has been forgotten. Sometimes two people who never met arrive independently at similar thoughts. Sometimes they disagree. Sometimes they misunderstand one another. And sometimes a borrowed idea becomes so deeply transformed that it eventually feels indigenous. Human culture has always worked this way. No pure beginning. This leads to a difficult conclusion. We may never find the first flood story, or the first sacred serpent, or the first divine child, or the first creation myth. The search for absolute beginnings may itself be misleading. Every text has a prehistory. Every language descends from earlier speech. Every ritual has antecedents. Every civilization inherits something. Even revolutionary ideas are born inside older vocabularies. History has beginnings, but those beginnings usually have beginnings of their own. What civilizations preserve? Perhaps the most meaningful comparison is therefore not which civilization invented the story first, but why did this civilization choose to preserve this version? Mesopotamia preserved Gilgamesh because his struggle with mortality continued to speak. Israel preserved Noah because catastrophe became connected with judgment, mercy, and covenant. India preserved Manu within a cosmology of preservation and renewal. The Mahabharata preserved Kurukshetra because victory itself had become a moral problem. The Bhagavad Gita preserved Arjuna's paralysis because action without meaning had become unbearable. Different civilizations take human vulnerability and transform it into sacred memory. And the gods remember differently. The divine figures themselves reveal these differences. Mesopotamian gods inhabit a plural divine society. They disagree. They fear. They desire. They can regret catastrophe. Biblical monotheism increasingly concentrates cosmic authority in one god. The Vedic world contains multiple devas within a ritual cosmos, while simultaneously developing speculative movements toward deeper unity. The Upanishads ask about Brahman. Later Vaishnava traditions identify the absolute personally with Vishnu or Krishna. Saiva traditions center Shiva. Shakta traditions center Devi. Advaita moves toward radical non-duality. These are not simply different names for an identical doctrine. Sometimes they are genuinely different metaphysical visions. Respecting traditions means allowing them to disagree. The question behind all the stories. And yet beneath the disagreements, one question continues to return. What does it mean to be human in a universe we did not create and cannot control? Gilgamesh answers by confronting death. Atrahasis answers through survival. Noah through covenant. Moses through liberation. The builders of Babel through ambition and fragmentation. The Vedic poets through sacrifice and sacred speech. The Upanishadic sages through inquiry into the self. Arjuna through the crisis of action. Krishna through a vision of reality in which action, knowledge, devotion, time, and the eternal self are brought together. The answers differ. The question survives. When civilizations began to remember the gods, we can now return to the thought with which our journey began. Civilizations do not only build cities, they build memory. Ubaid communities left houses, pottery, temples, and graves. Uruk added monumental cities and writing. Sumer placed gods, kings, grain, prayers, and myths onto clay. Akkad expanded political imagination toward empire. Babylonian scribes preserved stories already ancient in their own time. Israel and Judah transformed older Near Eastern images within a distinctive covenantal and monotheistic vision. Harappa created cities whose signs we can still see but cannot yet hear. Vedic India entrusted sacred knowledge to disciplined human memory. The epics transformed memory into vast moral worlds. And Bhakti transformed metaphysics into relationship. Different civilizations developed different ways of preventing meaning from disappearing. Clay tablet, seal, monument, genealogy, hymn, sacrifice, scripture, epic, mantra, song. Each says the same thing to time. Do not erase this. And perhaps that is why, thousands of years later, we are still listening. Chapter 17. The Long Memory of Humanity, when civilization became sacred memory. When we began this journey, we stood among the quiet settlements of the Ubaid world. There were no great empires, no monumental libraries, no epic literature, no known kings whose names still echo through history. Only villages, fields, canals, temples, families, and human beings attempting to build a stable life between earth and sky. Nothing about those communities announced that they stood near the beginning of a transformation that would eventually produce cities, writing, law, empire, scripture, philosophy, and some of the most influential religious traditions humanity has ever known. Yet from those modest beginnings emerged a chain of developments whose consequences still shape our world. The story of civilization is often told as a story of technological progress. Agriculture, cities, writing, metallurgy, trade, administration, states, empires. All of these developments matter. But after traveling through Mesopotamia, the Levant, and South Asia, another possibility becomes visible. Civilization is not only a history of increasing complexity. It is also a history of increasing memory. Human beings learned not merely how to build larger societies. They learned how to preserve meaning across generations. Civilization begins to reveal its deepest character when a community preserves not only food, tools, buildings, and territory, but also memory. It remembers its ancestors. It records its rulers. It sings hymns. It repeats sacred formulas. It tells stories about the beginning of the world. It remembers catastrophe. It asks why death exists. It creates temples, tablets, genealogies, rituals, scriptures, and epics. Civilization becomes, among many other things, an organized resistance against forgetting. Before history, there was memory. Modern scholarship commonly distinguishes between prehistory and history, with writing providing one of the principal boundaries between them. The distinction is useful, but philosophically, it is incomplete. Human beings possessed memory long before they possessed writing. Stories survived because someone remembered them. Songs survived because someone sang them. Rituals survived because someone performed them. A mother taught a song to her children. An elder remembered a migration. A ritual specialist preserved sacred words. A community remembered where its dead were buried. Before libraries existed as buildings, libraries existed within human beings. When a storyteller died, an entire library could disappear. Writing changed this. Not immediately, and not completely, but it changed the scale. For the first time, a voice could survive its speaker. A prayer could outlive its priest. A king could address descendants he would never meet. A civilization could begin speaking directly to the future. The clay tablets of Mesopotamia remain among the earliest surviving witnesses to that transformation. Thousands of years later, We can still hear echoes of people who could never have imagined that strangers in another age would one day read their words. Clay and breath. Perhaps nowhere is the contrast between civilizations more beautiful than in Mesopotamia and ancient India. Mesopotamia trusted clay. India trusted breath. The Mesopotamian scribe pressed a reed stylus into wet clay. The sign remained. Grain accounts survived. Royal names survived. Hymns survived. The flood survived. Gilgamesh survived. Even when cities collapsed, thousands of tablets slept beneath the earth waiting to be rediscovered. The Vedic tradition followed another path. Its oldest sacred archive was preserved for centuries, primarily through disciplined human memory. Every syllable mattered. Accent mattered. Pronunciation mattered. Sound itself possessed sacred authority. A hymn survived because one human being learned it from another and transmitted it onward. One civilization externalized memory into matter. The other developed extraordinary techniques for preserving it within consciousness. Both created technologies of remembrance. The first cities and the first questions. Urban civilization solved many problems. It also created new ones. Cities increased wealth. They also increased inequality. They increased opportunities for cooperation. They also increased opportunities for war. Bureaucracies organized resources. They also concentrated power. Empires connected territories. They also made destruction possible on unprecedented scales. As political systems became larger, human questions became larger as well. What legitimizes authority? Why do the innocent suffer? Can justice survive power? Do the gods care about humanity? What happens after death? Can human beings escape mortality? What is the relationship between the individual and cosmic order? These questions recur because civilization does not merely solve human problems. It creates new forms of them. The temple and the recitation. Ancient civilizations also discovered that memory requires repetition. A temple is not merely architecture. It creates a place to which people return. A ritual repeats an inherited order. A festival makes the past present again. A hymn survives because it is sung again. A story survives because it is retold. Mesopotamian temple rituals renewed relationships between city and deity. Vedic sacrifice repeatedly enacted relationships among humans, gods, fire, speech, and cosmos. Biblical festivals transformed historical and sacred events into communal remembrance. Later Hindu traditions remembered Krishna's birth, Rama's return, Shiva, Devi, and countless sacred events through festivals, pilgrimage, recitation, music, and ritual. Repetition is not merely repetition. It is a technology of continuity. A civilization survives because each generation reenacts what it believes should not disappear. Gilgamesh and the discovery of mortality. Perhaps no ancient literary work expresses the relationship between civilization and mortality more powerfully than the Epic of Gilgamesh. At the beginning, Gilgamesh seeks greatness. By the end, he seeks understanding. The death of Enkidu destroys the illusion that strength, kingship, architecture, or fame can protect a human being from mortality. Walls can be built. Cities can be expanded. Kingdoms can be conquered. Names can be carved into stone. But no political achievement abolishes death. Gilgamesh travels outward in search of immortality. He fails. Yet his failure becomes another kind of success. He does not discover biological immortality. He discovers the limits of being human. He returns to Uruk. The walls remain. Human creation remains. Memory remains. Civilization itself becomes a partial response to mortality. We build because we disappear. We write because memory fades. We tell stories because human life is short. Gilgamesh's question, therefore, remains unfinished. If we cannot escape death, how should we live? Floods and human vulnerability. The flood traditions of Mesopotamia, the Bible, and India preserve another recurring insight. Civilization is fragile. A river can overflow. A drought can destroy harvests. A storm can erase generations of labor. A city can disappear. An empire can collapse. The flood, therefore, becomes more than a possible memory of natural catastrophe. It becomes a symbol of the vulnerability of human order. Ziusudra survives. Atrahasis survives. Utnapishtim survives. Noah survives. Manu survives. The stories are not identical, and we should not force them into a single narrative. Yet they share one extraordinary image. Something must be carried through catastrophe so that life can begin again. The vessel, therefore, becomes an image of continuity. Every civilization eventually creates its own ark. For Mesopotamia, one such ark was the clay tablet. For ancient Israel, sacred textual and ritual memory. For India, among its most extraordinary forms, oral transmission. Later civilizations built libraries, monasteries, archives, universities, and now digital repositories. The ark changes form. The struggle against forgetting remains. The child in the river. The stories of Sargon, Moses, and Karna preserve another ancient image. The future appears first as vulnerability. An infant is endangered, placed within a vessel, exposed to water, separated from the circumstances of birth, found or raised elsewhere, destined for an extraordinary future. The narratives differ historically and theologically, and direct literary dependence cannot simply be assumed among all of them. But the symbolic pattern is powerful. The one who will later exercise extraordinary agency begins life unable even to protect himself. The river is simultaneously danger and passage. The container resembles both coffin and womb. Death seems possible. Instead, another birth occurs. Whether such motifs traveled between cultures or sometimes emerged independently, they preserve a striking human intuition. Great destinies may begin in complete helplessness. Civilization as gain and loss. Ancient literature rarely presents civilization as uncomplicated progress. Enkidu becomes civilized. He gains human companionship, food, clothing, language, social identity, and eventually fame. But he also loses his former relationship with the animals. Adam and Eve gain knowledge. They lose Eden. The builders of Babel gain extraordinary technological ability. Their project ends in fragmentation. Gilgamesh gains wisdom only after losing Enkidu. Arjuna receives spiritual teaching because the civilized order around him has reached the catastrophe of war. Again and again, ancient narratives seem to recognize something modern theories of progress sometimes forget. Every human achievement can carry a price. Civilization gives. Civilization also takes away. The biblical transformation. The Hebrew Bible emerged within the ancient Near Eastern world and inherited many of its cultural forms, images, questions, and narrative environments. Yet inherited material could be transformed. The flood becomes connected with judgment, mercy, and covenant. Creation becomes inseparable from responsibility. Babel becomes a meditation on human ambition, unity, power, and limitation. Moses becomes associated not with imperial conquest, but with liberation from oppression and covenantal identity. The prophetic tradition repeatedly places power beneath ethical judgment. The central question becomes not merely, how can civilization survive? But, what kind of civilization deserves to survive? Can power exist without justice? Can memory survive exile? Can a people preserve identity after losing land, temple, monarchy, and political independence. Sacred memory becomes an ethical force. The past is preserved not simply to be admired. It judges the present. The Vedic turn inward. Ancient India develops another extraordinary movement. The earliest Vedic hymns inhabit a world of sacred speech, sacrifice, gods, cosmic powers, cattle, rain, fire, soma, and ritual order. Later Upanishadic thought increasingly turns the question inward. Who performs the sacrifice? Who sees? Who hears? Who knows? Who am I? Not socially, not politically, not economically, but fundamentally. What remains when temporary identities disappear? The search for ultimate reality becomes inseparable from the investigation of consciousness. The sacred fire outside begins to acquire its counterpart within. The cosmos and the self begin to mirror one another. The mystery is no longer only, what is the universe? It becomes, who is the one experiencing the universe? Krishna and the human crisis. In the Bhagavad Gita, this inward movement meets one of the most dramatic crises imaginable. Arjuna does not suffer from ignorance of military technique. He knows how to fight. He no longer knows why he should fight. That distinction is essential. His crisis is not technical. It is existential. What should I do? What is my responsibility? What does duty mean when every possible action causes suffering? How can I act without becoming imprisoned by action? What is the self? What dies? What does not die? The Gita does not solve these questions by pretending that life is simple. It places philosophy directly inside catastrophe. The battlefield becomes a field of consciousness. Gilgamesh and Arjuna. Placed side by side, Gilgamesh and Arjuna reveal two profoundly different responses to mortality. Gilgamesh encounters death through the body of Enkidu. Arjuna encounters death before the bodies have fallen. Gilgamesh asks, how can I avoid death? Arjuna asks, how can I act when death is unavoidable? Gilgamesh travels across the world seeking immortality. Arjuna remains between two armies, while Krishna directs him toward the nature of the self. Utnapishtim teaches Gilgamesh that bodily immortality is not the ordinary human destiny. Krishna teaches Arjuna that the deepest self is not destroyed when the body is destroyed. The metaphysical answers are different. The wound beneath them is recognizably human. Mortality has entered consciousness, and consciousness demands meaning. Many gods, one reality, or something beyond all categories. Our journey has also shown how differently civilizations imagine the sacred. Mesopotamia preserved a plural divine society. Gods possess personalities, functions, relationships, conflicts, and hierarchies. The biblical tradition increasingly concentrates ultimate cosmic authority in one god. The Vedic world preserves many devas while simultaneously developing increasingly profound speculation concerning underlying unity. The Upanishads ask about Brahman. Later Hindu traditions develop multiple theological and philosophical answers. Vaishnavas may understand Vishnu or Krishna as supreme. Saivas may understand Shiva as supreme. Shaktas may understand Devi as ultimate reality. Advaita Vedanta interprets the deepest reality through non-dual Brahman. Vaishishthadvaita preserves unity while affirming real distinction. Dvaita insists upon an enduring distinction between God and individual souls. Gaudiya Vaishnavism articulates Achintya Bhedabheda, inconceivable simultaneous difference and non-difference, while placing Krishna at the center of ultimate reality. These traditions cannot responsibly be reduced to. They are all saying exactly the same thing. They are not. Sometimes they genuinely disagree. Respecting traditions means allowing them to disagree. Agreement is not the only sign of spiritual seriousness. Sometimes disagreement itself reveals the depth of humanity's search. History and faith. Throughout this journey, we have repeatedly encountered a boundary. History asks one kind of question. Faith asks another. History asks, what happened? When? What evidence survives? How old is this text? What can archaeology establish? Could these cultures have been in contact? Faith asks, what does this mean? Why does it matter? Is this sacred? How should I live? What is ultimately real? Historical scholarship cannot determine whether a prayer is heard. Religious conviction cannot by itself establish an archaeological date. A carbon date cannot tell us whether Krishna is Svayam Bhagavan. Devotion cannot provide a radiocarbon measurement. Archaeology cannot determine whether Atman is identical with Brahman. Philosophy cannot excavate Akkad. Problems begin when one form of knowledge is asked to perform the work of all the others. Wisdom may begin by recognizing both the value and the limits of each. The mystery of origins. Many questions remain unresolved. We still cannot read the Indus script. We still do not know the exact location of Akkad. We cannot reconstruct every stage through which ancient Near Eastern traditions became biblical literature. We cannot hear the oral stories that preceded the first surviving flood tablets. We cannot determine with certainty the historical event, if any single event existed, behind every episode of the Mahabharata. We cannot reconstruct a complete historical biography of Krishna. And perhaps this uncertainty teaches something important. The deeper we travel into the past, the more history becomes a conversation with silence. Fragments survive. Many voices do not. The responsible response to that silence is neither dogmatic skepticism nor imaginative certainty. It is humility. What archaeology cannot recover. Even when archaeology succeeds spectacularly, something remains beyond its reach. Excavation can recover walls, not hopes. It can recover temples, not prayers. It can recover graves, not grief. It can recover weapons, not fear. It can recover inscriptions, not the tone of the voice that first spoke the words. Love, wonder, faith, doubt, memory, meaning. These rarely fossilize, and yet they may be among the most powerful forces in history. Archaeology gives us the material traces of human beings. Sacred literature, myth, poetry, and philosophy sometimes allow us to approach something different. The traces they left within consciousness. The danger of pure origins. Human beings repeatedly search for origins. The first civilization. The first religion. The first flood story. The first revelation. The original wisdom. The untouched tradition. History rarely gives us such purity. Every civilization inherits. Every language has ancestors. Every sacred tradition passes through human communities. Every text has a history of preservation. Even revolutionary ideas are expressed through older words. This does not make tradition meaningless. It makes preservation more extraordinary. Nothing survives automatically. Someone remembers. Someone teaches. Someone copies the tablet. Someone recites the hymn. Someone rebuilds the temple. Someone carries the manuscript. Someone tells the child. Behind every surviving civilization stand countless unnamed guardians of memory. The same human mind. Not every similarity between civilizations requires borrowing. Human beings everywhere possess similar bodies and confront many of the same experiences. We are born helpless. We fear abandonment. We love. We experience jealousy. We watch storms. We see rivers flood. We encounter snakes. We watch the sun disappear and return. We dream. We become ill. We grow old. We bury the dead. We know that we too will die. It should not surprise us that cultures separated by enormous distances sometimes produce similar symbols. A flood can become catastrophe. A mountain can become the meeting place of heaven and earth. A serpent can become danger, renewal, wisdom, or death. A child can embody threatened possibility. Fire can mediate between visible and invisible worlds. Historical transmission is one explanation for similarity. Shared human experience is another. Sometimes both may be operating simultaneously. Civilization is a conversation. Civilizations, therefore, should not be imagined as sealed boxes. They resemble conversations. Sometimes the speakers meet directly. Sometimes they communicate through interpreters. Sometimes merchants carry stories alongside goods. Sometimes conquerors carry gods. Sometimes captives carry memories. Sometimes a story crosses languages until its original source is forgotten. Sometimes two civilizations that never met arrive at similar images independently. Ideas travel, but they also transform. A borrowed story never remains merely borrowed once another civilization has made it part of its own understanding of reality. Civilization as sacred memory. Perhaps this brings us to the deepest conclusion of our journey. Civilizations do not survive merely because they build. They survive because they remember. A city can disappear. A language can vanish. A kingdom can collapse. A temple can burn. An empire can become a name in a textbook. Yet a story can continue. A prayer can continue. A melody can continue. A philosophical question can continue. The survival of civilization, therefore, cannot be measured only in monuments. It must also be measured in memory. Mesopotamia remembered Gilgamesh. Ancient Israel remembered Noah and Moses. India remembered Vedic hymns, Upanishadic questions, the Mahabharata, and Krishna. Each tradition preserved what it considered essential. Each transmitted a vision of reality. Each spoke toward generations not yet born. The conversation across millennia. When we place these traditions beside one another, we do not diminish them. We begin to hear them more clearly. The purpose of comparison is not to prove that all religions are identical, nor is it to prove that one civilization borrowed everything from another. Comparison reveals both connection and difference. It allows us to distinguish what may have traveled historically from what may have arisen independently. It reveals shared questions without erasing different answers. The civilizations we have explored were separated by geography, language, politics, chronology, and theology. Yet they repeatedly returned to fundamental mysteries: life, death, justice, suffering, order, chaos, power, memory, consciousness, the sacred, and the possibility that existence possesses a meaning deeper than survival alone. Why these stories still matter? One final question remains. Why should people living in the 21st century care about Ubaid villages, Sumerian kings, Akkadian emperors, Babylonian scribes, biblical patriarchs, Harappan cities, Vedic sages, Arjuna, or Krishna? Because the technologies have changed. The questions have not. We still seek meaning. We still fear death. We still struggle with power. We still experience the fragility of civilization. We still ask whether justice can survive politics. We still wonder what consciousness is. We still search for truth. We still ask what, if anything, lies beyond death. And we still ask the question Arjuna could not escape. How should I live? Ancient civilizations do not provide one answer. That may be precisely why they remain valuable. They remind us that we belong to a conversation much older than ourselves. the long memory of humanity. The journey from Ubaid villages to the Bhagavad Gita spans thousands of years. Empires rose. Empires disappeared. Languages changed. Religions developed. Trade routes shifted. Cities were abandoned. New civilizations emerged. Yet something endured. Human beings continued asking questions that could not be solved merely by wealth, power, administration, or technology. Perhaps that is the deepest continuity in history. Not kings, not borders, not empires, but the persistent human search for meaning. And perhaps the greatest achievement of civilization is not simply that it built cities. Perhaps its greatest achievement is that it learned how to preserve that search. Across clay tablets, across sacred hymns, across oral lineages, across myths, across epics, across scriptures, across rituals, across centuries, across civilizations. The Ubaid potter could not know that thousands of years later someone would excavate the vessel shaped by his hands. The Babylonian scribe could not know that strangers would one day decipher his signs. The Vedic reciter could not know that his sacred syllables would still be pronounced millennia later. Those who first told stories of floods, kings, abandoned children, gods, heroes, death, and immortality could not know how far those stories would travel. And yet they preserved them. Perhaps every civilization, knowingly or unknowingly, speaks the same quiet command to time. Do not erase this. Cities fall. Empires disappear. Names are forgotten. But sometimes memory crosses the ruins. And thousands of years later, humanity can still hear itself speaking. And still recognize its own questions in the voices of the distant past. Epilogue, when civilizations began to remember the gods. We began among villages whose inhabitants left us no written explanation of who they believed themselves to be. We end among civilizations that had learned to speak across millennia. Between those two moments lies one of the greatest transformations in human history. The first cities were built. Kings appeared and disappeared. Empires conquered one another. Languages flourished and vanished. Gods received names. Stories became sacred. Questions became philosophy. Memory became civilization. And somewhere during that immense journey, humanity discovered something perhaps more important than writing itself. That what is remembered can outlive those who remember it. The Ubaid potter disappeared. The Sumerian scribe disappeared. Sargon disappeared. The builders of Uruk and Babylon disappeared. The poets who first sang the Vedic hymns disappeared. The voices that shaped the stories of Gilgamesh, Noah, Moses, Manu, Arjuna, and Krishna disappeared. But something crossed the boundary of their deaths. A fragment of meaning survived. Perhaps this is why the ancient world continues to fascinate us. We do not study it merely because it is old. We study it because somewhere inside its ruins we recognize ourselves. Gilgamesh's fear is still our fear. Arjuna's hesitation is still our hesitation. The desire to survive catastrophe remains ours. The temptation to build Babel remains ours. The search for justice remains ours. The longing to know whether death is the end remains ours. And the intuition that existence may contain something sacred, something greater than the individual life, has never completely left humanity. The civilizations explored in these pages did not give the same answers. They should not be forced to. Mesopotamia, the biblical world, the Indus civilization, and the Vedic and later Indian traditions arose from different histories and developed different understandings of humanity, divinity, death, cosmic order, and ultimate reality. Their differences matter as much as their similarities. But beneath those differences, we can recognize a shared human gesture. Again and again, human beings looked at a world they could not completely understand and refused to remain silent before it. They told stories. They prayed. They sacrificed. They questioned. They argued. They meditated. They sang. They built temples. They pressed signs into clay. They preserved syllables in memory. They looked toward heaven. And they looked within themselves. Perhaps the history of civilization is therefore not simply the history of how human beings learned to control the world. It is also the history of how they learned to stand before what they could not control. Flood, death, time, nature, consciousness, the sacred, the unknown. Civilizations gave these mysteries different names. Their answers changed. The questions remained. And perhaps somewhere between the clay tablet of Mesopotamia and the remembered syllable of the Vedic hymn lies one of the deepest truths of our common human story. We are creatures who know that we will disappear, yet continue creating things intended to survive us. A city, a story, a prayer, a melody, a question, a memory. Thousands of years later, we open the tablet, read the hymn, enter the ruined city, or listen again to an ancient story. For a moment, the distance collapses. The dead speak, and we listen. Perhaps that is what civilization has always been. Humanity remembering itself, while reaching toward something beyond itself. Author's note: this essay was written neither to prove that all ancient traditions originated from a single source, nor to establish the superiority of one civilization, religion, or interpretation over another. It began with a simpler question. What happens when we place some of humanity's oldest civilizations and sacred traditions beside one another and allow them to speak in their own voices? Along the way, archaeology met mythology, history met sacred memory, and texts separated by centuries and great distances sometimes revealed remarkable similarities, but also profound differences. Where historical evidence permits a conclusion, I have tried to follow it. Where the evidence remains uncertain, I have tried to preserve that uncertainty. And where we enter the domain of faith, theology, or metaphysical interpretation, I have tried to respect the distinction between what history can establish and what a religious tradition understands as sacred truth. This distinction does not require us to choose between reason and wonder. One can recognize the historical development of a sacred text and still be moved by it. One can study the archaeology of an ancient civilization without reducing its religious world to pottery, ruins, and dates. One can compare Gilgamesh and the Bible, Sargon and Moses, Mesopotamian flood traditions and Manu, or ancient Near Eastern religion and the Vedic world without assuming either that everything was borrowed or that every similarity was accidental. The ancient world was connected, but human beings were also human everywhere. Stories traveled. Symbols transformed. Memories survived. And sometimes, different peoples may have looked into the same mysteries and discovered different answers. Perhaps this is the most important thought I would like to leave with the reader. We do not honor ancient civilizations by making them agree with us, nor do we honor them by forcing them to agree with one another. We honor them by listening carefully enough to recognize both what they shared and what made each of them unique. The ruins remain silent. The texts do not. And between archaeology and sacred memory, there remains a space in which neither certainty nor skepticism should become absolute. It is the space of inquiry, of humility, of wonder, and perhaps, after thousands of years of dialogue. The past does not ask us merely to believe it, nor does it ask us merely to explain it. It asks us to listen